As I stated earlier, we now have a solid historical backdrop of the colonial experience when it comes to English settlement in the New World, from the very beginning of settlement, Jamestown in 1607, through 1763. And let me remind you once again that 1763 is important in two ways. Number one, it marks the end of what's called the 7 Years of War, and we'll talk about this very shortly. But it also marks the beginning of colonial conflict. That's going to culminate, of course, with July 4th, 1776, and the American Revolutionary War. So by 1763, we could start to distinguish something that's called American identity, American character. And moreover, we could distinguish it from what you could call English character or English identity, the English outlook. All right. Now, this is kind of tricky because the colonials, of course, are English. In fact, as I just stated, they're very proud to be English, especially because at this time, arguably, the British Empire is the most powerful in the world. They just defeat the powerful French Empire. That is to say, England and its allies defeated the powerful French Empire. And, France and England are perennial enemies throughout the age of European imperialism. And because of that defeat, or because of English victory, they make claims, right, of them being the most powerful empire in the world. And let's recall that imperial rivalry was very important back then. So the colonials were very proud to be part of the British Empire. And they were loyal subjects, again, to the British crown. Yet, despite that, again, we can start to pinpoint certain American characteristics that mark it separate from what we call English. So, when we look at this list here, this should all be familiar to everyone because we've talked about it since the beginning of English settlement. And these key ideas are going to indelibly shape the crystallization of American character and the American attitude, the American outlook. And needless to say, this American outlook is still true today, right? So let's go through these and see how they contributed. Well, we talked about how in the beginning of settlement, it was marked by decentralized political life, not to mention decentralized religious life. What does this mean again? It means there's no overarching authority emanating from a particular monarch or even parliament, which is, again, the legislative institution in England that is dictating the way of life in the colonies. Rather, the colonials are left to their own devices, so to say, on purpose. Let's recall solitary neglect again, right? And basically, Americans, we can start using that word, right? By 1763 are used to this. They're used to political life being purely local. They're used, or let me say they're not used to the English institutions like the monarchy and parliament exerting too much influence in their life, whether it's politics or religion. So you can see how that's going to flow into the American character, right? The American character, to put it in the language of today's political discourse, actually, they distrust, quote, big government. They're distrustful, of an institution that tries to legislate, that tries to control, that dictates the patterns and the ways of thought, even from this sort of overarching authority again, right? And of course, that's true in religious life. And you can see the connection here with classical liberalism, right? Liberalism, again, is the belief that individuals, or in the case of, political life, citizens. Citizens um, have the freedom of their own political beliefs, their own religious beliefs, their own economic beliefs. And moreover, those beliefs cannot be intervened or, interfered by the state or the government. The government can't intervene in the beliefs of the individual citizen, right? And needless to say, this is a big part of American life today, right? It's bedrock, it's foundational to the American attitude. Now, the second one, again, is something we've discussed a lot, and that's lack of pure feudalism. And when we think, again, about feudalism, it's characterized by rigidity in terms of social stratification. It's marked by hereditary status to the point where, the elite class especially inherit by birth their status, and the lowly peasants, right, let alone the indentured servants and the slaves, are destined to that life at the bottommost ranks of society. And again, this is marked by lack of fluidity, but rather by fixity. Okay, so we don't see that in the colonial experience before 1763, and this is something unique again in that particular time frame between 1600 and 1763. It's one of the only places in the world that you could say it lacks this pure feudalism, if not pre-feudal systems, right, that we see with tribal groups in, let's say, sub-Saharan Africa or parts of Asia, what have you. Okay, so there is this mobility and fluidity in society, and we associate that with freedom, right? And even today, we talk about things like the American dream, and pursuing your goals, and climbing up the ladder, so to speak, right? So this is a very American idea, American attitude. It's there from the beginning, and just to compare it with English outlook again, they're still mired in feudalism. Now, it's slowly disappearing, but that's the key word. It's slowly disappearing, right? Rather than evaporating overnight. Okay, so the next one is the English tradition of freedom. That's something that was brought over as early as, if you recall, the Rights of Englishmen during the Bacon's Rebellion, whereby, it was argued that regardless of your station in life, people have freedom. Okay, so let's also recall the history of ideas, or the intellectual history that happened within England among English intellectuals in particular, and other Enlightenment philosophers as well. We discussed, for example, rule of law. We discussed a balanced constitution. We discussed checks and balances in government. And again, liberalism and republicanism. So all these ideas are part and parcel of the colonial experience, especially by the 18th century. Now, I don't want to exaggerate. I don't want to say that it's completely horizontal society again, where everyone enjoys his freedoms. Of course not. But again, we're comparing something called American versus something called England, right? And when we compare it, we see it's very impressive. The degree to which there are these freedoms in the colonies is really unique at that time. Okay, and we can't ignore the role of the environment of the New World. And this is interesting because here we're talking about not only, let's say, the conditions, let's say the land, the terrain, the mountain ranges and the swamps in North Carolina, right, in South Carolina, the cold winters in New England and everything. It's very different depending on the region, but one thing they all share, regardless of where you are in the New World, is something called the frontier. Now, let me define the frontier here. And this brings us to that dichotomy between civilization versus savagery. Here's the way that American historians of the past, and the reason why I'm saying this is because some of these historians are becoming sort of outmoded in their theories and their thesis, right? In today's world, the 21st century. But nonetheless, they're outmoded because they emphasize civilization too much, right? In any case, when it comes to the frontier, let's recall that dualism between civilization versus savagery. Now, when it comes to the social landscape, or even let's call it the geographical landscape even, right? When it comes to the settlement patterns from 1607, Jamestown, through 1763, we see the English settled in a certain area. In the very beginning, for example, in the early 1600s, it was just on the immediate coast, right, of the East Coast in New England, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, right there by the coast, the seaboard. But of course, you see expansion, and we already talked about this with explosive growth during the 18th century, and that includes geographical expansion. Another term for this is westward movement, right? So you see this westward movement constantly happening, and as time unfolds, we see the demarcation line between English settlement and the area or geography beyond, in the West, beyond English settlement, actually constantly moving west, right, as time passes by. Okay, so the frontier in all this is that line of demarcation separating English settlement towards the east and the uncharted territory to the west of that line of separation. Okay, so the frontier again refers to that line of separation or the line of demarcation separating, in the language back then, separating civilization versus savagery. Okay, so think of the frontier again as that meeting point between the unknown and the known. This is from the English point of view, right? Their settlement area, they know this area, but beyond that, it's this great unknown. You could call it terra incognita, to use a Latin term, right? Uncharted territory. Now, when you think about the colonial experience, this meant two things: unexplored land, which, by the way, could be gained for their own possession, right? So there's always westward expansion in the pursuit of land to the west, and that's going to happen throughout the 19th century, the future. But also, it means the presence of hostile Indians who are going to be engaged in skirmishes and raids and acts of violence, even war, with the English settlers, especially as the English settlers keep moving west, right? Okay, so again, the frontier refers to that line of separation, and just beyond the frontier, of course, is savagery, the unknown. Now, going back to how this shapes the American outlook, well, here's the thing. Colonials from the very beginning had to deal with the frontier and with the unknown, with uncharted territory to the west. They had that through their entire colonial experience. And that's unique to the English in the colonies, as opposed to English in England, where there is no frontier, so to say. So the fact that there's this frontier always present and always there, and it's seen as a menace in many ways, as well as being sort of an enticement, right, to quote conquer the frontier, because especially the land, not to mention after we form our country, the expansion of our country itself, the United States of America, um, it's always there. And this contributes, according to historians, to what you could call the American outlook. To be more specific, historians argue that it contributed to certain quintessential American traits and values. And again, characteristics like, for example, innovation, ingenuity, the ability to improvise, right, amid uncertain conditions, risk taking, right? In fact, from the very beginning of settlement, even the Puritans and early settlers in, let's say, indentured servants in the New World, you had to be a risk taker to actually move to the New World, and that still applies in 1763. So all these qualities, again, that I just mentioned, which even today are invoked as being especially American, American innovation, right? And so on and so forth. One can argue that the environment, and to be more specific, the frontier itself, is the decisive factor in shaping that particular characteristic. Now, a more academic way of referring to this is environmental determinism. And determinism basically means, or it refers to a view that certain forces beyond, let's say, human free will or human decision making actually determine outcomes of a person's life, or if you're talking about history, determines history itself, right? In general, determinism refers to that. Let me give you an example. Let's say in today's discussion of foreign policy, if you firmly believe that the reason why we're in the Middle East is because of oil, our need for petroleum, for energy, right, which is really what's fueling, literally, our economic system in many ways, then you are what's called an economic determinist. Okay, you're putting economics as the determining force in foreign policy in the Middle East. You can even talk about something called psychological determinism, and that's especially true with someone like Freud, for example. Freud, who was a psychologist in the 1920s, 1930s. I'm sure you probably heard of him, but he posited the existence of, subconscious or unconscious forces that determine, there's that word, determine your behavior, unbeknownst to you. It goes against your own free will. For example, if you're a gambler, if you're addicted to gambling, you can't help it, right? You're trying to stop. You're trying to use your free will to stop, but you can't help it. Why? Because you have this subconscious force acting upon your behavior. Okay, so we could apply the concept of determinism to how the environment shapes American character, right? Environmental determinism refers to that. And, this is kind of interesting because usually the story, when you think about, quote, man versus nature, unquote, you think about man conquering nature, right? And in fact, this is still a common theme, even today in our pop culture, like Survivor TV shows, right? Or Naked and Afraid, right? Where they have to deal with nature in an unadulterated sense. Well, here's a case where it's argued that in the case of man versus nature, it's really nature who determines, quote, man, right? When you think about environmental determinism. All right, so the last point again is that the frontier indelibly shaped something called the American character. It's unique to Americans. Let's call them American colonials. It's unique to the colonials and something you don't see with the English. So now we can start talking about Americans. Now we can use that term in the course. Now it is more definitive in our understanding of what it refers to by 1763.